I wanted to work at the same bank where my father works. During my final interview, someone known as the demon instructor made it clear they looked down on me because I was from a single-parent family. They had no intention of hiring me. I was struggling to handle it, and the interview kept getting worse. At my breaking point, I pulled out my phone and called my father, who is the bank's president. "My name is Emma Miller. I'm 23 and a college senior looking for a job. My parents divorced last year, and now my mom is a single mother. I stayed with her, but I've always wanted to work at the bank where my father is the CEO. The bank is the largest in the country, and I admire my father's work there. Tomorrow I have my final interview for a job at the bank. I'm not great at studying, and when I told people I wanted to work there, they tried to stop me and make fun of me. I thought it would be over after the interview, but it was awful. One day in college, a friend named Julia asked me where I was going after graduation. I told her I wanted to work at the bank. People around us started whispering. Julia then told me, "Emma, you should know your place." I was shocked that someone I considered a friend was insulting me. When I tried to defend myself, another guy said, "It's impossible for you. That place is the largest bank in the country. Getting a job from this university is really tough. In the past 10 years, only one person has managed to get a job at the bank I'm applying to." I haven't told anyone that my father is president. I didn't want to cause trouble for my father like being talked about, especially when it wasn't true. When Julia said those things, I felt everyone's eyes on me. It was painful to hear. A teacher, Miss Anderson, came over and asked what was happening. The boy from earlier said I wanted to work at North Trust Bank. The teacher looked at me and then said something shocking. "Are you taking society for granted?" Even the teacher who was supposed to support students was against my dream. No one was there to back me up. I tried to defend myself, but the teacher said I was naive. I mentioned that my father is an interviewer for North Trust Bank and that he's known as a demon interviewer. Miss Anderson, a 29-year-old teacher, seemed to react strongly. She said if I met an interviewer with the same last name, it would likely be her father. When I answered honestly that I come from a single-parent household, Miss Anderson's smile turned sinister. At that time, I didn't understand why Miss Anderson was smiling so strangely. The argument ended with a ringing for the start of class. After that moment, people's attitudes toward me grew colder. My so-called friends, including Julia and my classmates, started avoiding me. It felt like they didn't want to be associated with someone they thought was foolish. Their reactions worsened as I passed each exam. The North Trust Bank hiring process had 4 stages: a written test, 2 interviews with head office staff, and finally an interview with the top hiring manager. I wanted to work at the bank's Sun Plaza branch and had managed to pass the 3rd stage. People were shocked and worried about my progress, especially those who had looked down on me. Many of them had failed the 2nd stage of their desired company's interviews. It had been 3 months since job hunting began, and in my class, no one had a confirmed job offer. The atmosphere was filled with panic, envy, and anxiety. I couldn't handle it anymore and left the room. When I got home, my mother's comforting presence helped me. I took a break from university, and soon the day of the final interview arrived. My mother reminded me to just do my best. I left the house after my mother encouraged me. When I arrived at the interview venue, I was taken to the waiting room. Originally, there were about 300 applicants for the Sun Plaza branch, but now only around 10 were left, and only 3 would be chosen. As I was about to close my eyes to focus, my name was called. I went in and saw 3 people in the room. Anderson, the teacher's father, a man who seemed to be the chief hiring officer, and another man, presumably responsible for keeping records, who was sitting at a computer. The interview started with Anderson asking typical questions like self-introduction and motivation for applying. I answered these easily until Anderson suddenly complained about female bank employees, saying they have quiet voices, are physically weak, and think being nice is enough to please people. I realized that Anderson was likely someone who misreads subordinates, making this a stressful interview. Silences are bad in interviews, so I tried to respond flexibly, mentioning my strength from being in a sports club and my readiness to work hard. However, Anderson didn't seem impressed and just looked at his papers. The chief hiring officer, who should have been in charge, said nothing. Anderson might have been pressuring him, but there was nothing I could do except endure. After a brief silence, Anderson spoke again and asked if I came from a single-parent household, likely referring to the documents I submitted. My application included my address and family details. When I told Anderson that I lived with my mother after my parents' divorce, he started laughing and made a sinister comment. "What business does a poor person from a single-mother household have here?" His mocking attitude made me nervous and sweaty. I struggled to respond but couldn't think of the right words. Anderson continued to taunt me, saying, "Do you think that company would hire someone from a poor single-parent family like you?" I raised my voice, defending myself, but Anderson seemed to be waiting for a confrontation. He asked if my attitude was defiant toward him. I was frustrated but couldn't think of a good comeback. I didn't want to lose my chance with a bank I had always admired because of one man's behavior, but I was at a loss for words. When Anderson continued to pressure me, I felt a sudden calmness. I stood up from the metal chair, surprising everyone. Anderson and the others were confused and asked what I was doing. I realized that Anderson might have shared information from his daughter, the teacher, which seemed like a breach of privacy. Ignoring his threats, I took out my phone and started making a call. Anderson warned me that if I didn't stop, he'd reject me on the spot, but I wasn't intimidated. I called my father, Dan, and told him about Anderson's behavior. I asked him to come to the interview room. My father agreed to come in about 10 minutes after hanging up. The person in charge of recording the interview stared at me in shock. Anderson, clearly upset, pointed at me and said, "You finished making a phone call during an interview? This is unheard of. Go home." I decided I couldn't take it anymore and spoke up. I told Anderson, "This isn't an interview. It's you who's finished." The chief hiring officer and the recorder were surprised by my confrontation, indicating that no one had stood up to Anderson before. Anderson slammed his hand on the table, but I didn't flinch. I asked him if he knew Brian Wilson, the president of the bank. Anderson's reaction showed I had hit a nerve. He asked if I was mocking him, and I explained that my last name used to be Wilson. My father is Brian Wilson, the bank's president. The room went silent and Anderson looked uneasy. As I confirmed my identity, just then my father entered the room and addressed Anderson, saying, "This is hardly an interview at all, Mr. Anderson." The two men stood up and greeted my father as he entered, clearly realizing the gravity of the situation. Anderson had made comments like, "She's not good at studying. There's no way she could get into North Trust Bank, and if she can, so can I." He made it clear they couldn't forgive me for trying for something they thought was impossible. The harsh reality of job hunting showed that jealousy was driving their actions. The teacher's words and actions, given that her father was in charge of hiring, made the situation worse. I knew that if the teacher led the attack, the other students would follow. That day, I looked at my father and felt his presence was overpowering. As the president of the bank, his intimidating appearance and deep, resonant voice made Anderson's face go pale. My father asked Anderson, "What were you doing to my daughter?" My father, a large man with a shaved head and a scar on his forehead, had an intimidating presence. Even Anderson, usually so confident, sweat and looked nervous, replying, "Yes, sir," at my father's tone. My father then turned to the chief hiring officer, Green, who had been sitting quietly. "Aren't you the chief hiring officer?" Have you let this tyrant run wild until now?" he demanded. Green, whose name I learned for the first time, bent at a 90-degree angle and bowed, apologizing profusely. The young clerk, who had done nothing wrong, was visibly scared and sweating. My father then addressed him in a surprisingly gentle voice. "Hey, clerk, what's your name?" "My name is Harris, Mr. Wilson," the clerk replied. "Can you send today's interview record to my PCs? And you're also recording the audio, right?" my father requested. I later found out that the bank's interviews were both transcribed and recorded as backups. This ensured that Anderson's misconduct was thoroughly documented, and he was subsequently punished. Anderson, who had previously seemed so powerful, was now trembling and looked like a frog staring down a snake. My father continued, "Anderson, apologize to my daughter. It's not because she's my daughter. You've trampled on the feelings of young people who wanted to join this bank." Anderson, now clearly frightened, bowed deeply and apologized. Even after witnessing his apology, I couldn't bring myself to forgive him. My father, walking up to Anderson with the air of a lion about to hunt, said, "Do you know what will happen to you if you do something like this again?" Anderson was frozen, unable to respond. The scene that followed was intense and dramatic. Anderson, now fully exposed, began to sweat profusely and revealed to my father that he had mistreated over 100 people. The sheer scale of his misconduct was shocking. The fact that he had been unchecked for so long made me doubt the integrity of the hiring practices at the company. My father, visibly upset, turned to Green and said, "Hey, Green, I trusted you to handle the hiring, and this is the result. It's my mistake for not catching this earlier." He then declared his intention to reform the personnel system to prevent future victims and announced that Anderson would be held accountable. "I'll gather all the victims and create a victims group. I'm prepared to make this public and face any consequences," he said, his voice resolute. Anderson, clearly overwhelmed by the turn of events, collapsed, unable to handle the weight of his actions and the public scrutiny. My father opened a window to let fresh air into the tense room, and the atmosphere seemed to shift as everyone in the room realized the gravity of the situation. Despite the dramatic end to the interview, I did pass the final stage. It was not due to my father's influence, but because the hiring managers, after reviewing the recorded audio, made a fair decision. The hiring practices for those previously rejected by Anderson were also reevaluated, leading to a more just outcome. The next day, the news spread. My father publicly apologized and expressed his commitment to reforming the hiring practices. His genuine apology and resolve impressed many, and he continued his role as the bank president. In contrast, Green resigned voluntarily, and Anderson faced severe repercussions. Legal action from both the company and the victims group followed. The extent of Anderson's past misconduct came to light, and he was arrested for defamation. Back at the university, the teacher, Miss Miller, with a forced smile, congratulated me on my job offer. It was a hollow gesture given the circumstances. At that moment, my father and the principal arrived in the classroom. "Miss Miller," my father introduced himself. "This is Brian Wilson, the president of North Trust Bank." The room was silent, the weight of recent events hanging heavily in the air. The once intimidating teacher was now facing the consequences of her actions and the exposure of her father's misconduct. The atmosphere in the classroom shifted dramatically as the truth about my father's identity became known. The realization that I was the daughter of Brian Wilson, the president of North Trust Bank, caused a stir among my classmates. Many seemed to regret not having been more respectful or friendly. Miss Miller, who had been openly critical of me, was visibly shaken. The principal, clearly displeased with her actions, confronted her directly. "This school operates with support from Mr. Wilson's bank. It seems you've been bad-mouthing his daughter. What do you have to say for yourself?" The teacher, cornered, admitted to the principal that the negative comments about me had been true. My father made it clear that if those who harassed me did not voluntarily leave the school, he would cut off support, which would result in significant financial consequences for the institution. Faced with the ultimatum, the teacher and many classmates chose to leave the school. Their apologies were barely audible, and their departures marked a significant change in the class dynamics. The principal's decision and my father's influence led to a swift and decisive resolution. More than half of the students who had been involved in the harassment withdrew voluntarily. Those who did not come forward faced potential legal action, which led to a cascade of confessions. Although the individuals involved avoided legal repercussions, their enrollment was canceled, ensuring they would not continue at the university. With the support of my father and the resolved issues, I secured my future. My college now felt fresh, and I was determined to expand and follow in my father's footsteps as a bank president. I resolved to make the most of my opportunities and contribute meaningfully to the world.